A 5-year-old girl found a chained monster in a basement. She didn't run. She sat down beside him. That monster would become her father. In 2024, I was invisible. A ghost on my hands and knees at 3 in the morning, scrubbing blood from casino floors while powerful men walked past me like I was nothing. They threw me away 5 years ago for the crime of getting pregnant. No hospital would take me. No one would hire me. I raised my daughter Mia alone, in a room with no heat, feeding her instant soup. Her only toy was a stuffed bear I found in the garbage. But that freezing November night, while I was scrubbing floors, my sick little girl wandered into the forbidden halls looking for me. She found a steel door. Behind it, a man in chains, beaten, bloody, the most feared crime lord in Chicago. My 5-year-old daughter looked at this bleeding monster and asked if he was okay. What happened next started a war. It put killers at our door. And it destroyed everything I thought I knew about power, about monsters, and about love. This story will prove that your past does not define your future, that redemption can come from the hands society has thrown away, and that sometimes the most broken people are the only ones who can save each other. If you've ever felt invisible, worthless, or forgotten, this story is for you. Stay with me until the end. The clock on the wall read 6 o'clock in the morning when Val finally put the bucket down. Her back throbbed with a pain so deep it felt like a slab of rock had been fused to her spine for the past 8 hours. She straightened her body slowly, the sound of her knees cracking in the silence. Her hands were numb, pruned from hours of immersion in cold, chemical-laced water. All around her, the Black Diamond Casino was finally quiet. The wealthy patrons had departed in their expensive cars, leaving behind a mess of stains, broken glass, and the unseen people like Val, tasked with erasing the evidence of the night's indulgence. She changed out of her cleaning uniform inside a cramped staff room, then pulled on a thin coat with worn-out shoulders that she had purchased from a second-hand store 3 years ago. She slipped out into the alley behind the casino, the designated entrance for people like her. The November wind in Chicago was a blade against her skin. Val hunched into the inadequate coat and hurried down streets still cloaked in darkness. She walked 4 blocks every single day because she could not afford the bus fare. 4 blocks through back alleys choked with garbage and the sharp smell of urine, where addicts leaned against brick walls and rats scurried past, unafraid of humans. This was the South Side, Chicago's forgotten territory, a place where police rarely bothered to drive, and the law was an unattainable dream. Val picked up her pace as she walked by a group of men smoking in front of a shuttered bar. She kept her head down, met no one's eyes, and made herself invisible, a skill she had perfected over years of practice. Finally, she arrived at the old apartment building she called home, its concrete steps crumbling and its peeling walls covered in spray paint. The air inside was heavy with the smell of dampness and spoiled food. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and paused at apartment 37, tapping lightly 3 times out of habit. The door swung open to reveal Abuela Carmen. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her old eyes were still full of warmth as she looked at Val like a daughter she never had. She was a woman from Puerto Rico who had lived in this part of the city for over 40 years. She was a widow with no children, and the only person on earth who did not view Val with disdain. Their paths had crossed 5 years before on a bitter winter night, when a pregnant and frantic Val had been thrown onto the street by Rico Santino. She had collapsed right outside Carmen's door. Abuela Carmen took her in, saving her life. She let her stay for 2 weeks and helped her deliver Mia in that tiny room, since no hospital would admit a young woman without insurance or money. From that day on, they had forged their own family. 2 souls left behind by the world, relying on each other to get by. Every night, Val went to her job. Carmen would look after Mia. In exchange, Val did her laundry and cleaned her apartment, never asking for payment. Money never changed hands between them, only quiet trust and mutual gratitude. The little one slept soundly, Abuela Carmen whispered, moving aside so Val could enter. She drew pictures of you before she went to sleep. She said she missed her mommy. Val crossed the room to an old sofa where Mia was curled up under a thin blanket. Her dark hair fanned out on the pillow, and her angelic face was serene as she slept. Val sat down next to her daughter, stroking her hair gently. Her heart ached with a mixture of overwhelming love and suffocating guilt. Mia was her entire world, the sole reason she faced each day, the one source of light in her bleak existence. But Val knew she was not giving her child enough. She knew their one-room apartment was too cold in the winter. She knew her daughter's diet consisted mostly of instant soup and cheap bread. She knew Mia owned no toys, except for a tattered stuffed bear that Val had salvaged from the trash. You should go get some rest, Abuela Carmen said softly, her hand on Val's shoulder. You look completely worn out. Val gave a small nod and gently lifted Mia into her arms. The child remained asleep, her head nestled on her mother's shoulder. Val gave Carmen a thankful look, then slipped back into the hall and climbed one more flight of stairs to her own apartment, number 42. The room was oppressively small, containing just a single bed. The two of them made do with an old gas stove, a toilet that had no door, and a single window that looked out onto the brick wall of the next building. Val placed Mia on the bed, pulled the blanket up around her, and then slid to the cold floor, leaning her back against the wall. She was too exhausted to sleep, too empty to cry, too weary to even consider the future. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over Chicago, but its light never found its way into rooms like hers. 3 days after that night, Mia started to cough. They were small coughs at first, but they steadily grew worse, joined by a fever that made her forehead feel like a hot coal. Val pressed her hand against her daughter's head at 4 in the afternoon, her heart clenching at the intense heat radiating from that delicate skin. She had no money for a doctor, no health coverage, and no way to get her daughter into a hospital without being dismissed like a stray animal. Val ran to Abuela Carmen's apartment, only to find the older woman was also unwell. Her arthritis was causing her so much pain that she was unable to leave her bed. Bring Mia to me, Abuela Carmen offered weakly. I can try to keep an eye on her. But Val saw her trembling hands and her pale face, and she knew it was impossible. Mia needed someone who was alert, someone who could get help if the fever spiked dangerously. That night, Val was left with a single, terrible option. She had to take her daughter with her to the casino. She bundled Mia in their warmest blanket and carried her through the 4 blocks of biting wind. She whispered promises into her daughter's ear that it would all be okay, even though she did not believe the words herself. When she got to the Black Diamond, she entered through the employee entrance in the back and carried Mia to the small staff break room at the far end of the first-floor corridor. The room contained nothing more than a ripped sofa and a cabinet filled with cleaning, and a single dim yellow light bulb dangled from the ceiling. Val gently laid her daughter on the sofa and placed a cool, damp cloth on her forehead to help with the fever. She then knelt on the floor beside her and took Mia's small hand in hers. You need to listen to me, Val said, her voice steady despite her trembling. You must stay inside this room. Do not go outside for any reason. Do you understand me? This is not a safe place. I will come back to check on you every hour. You have to promise me. Mia gave a weak nod, her wide brown eyes filled with complete trust as she gazed at her mother. Val kissed her forehead before backing out of the room and shutting the door. Her heart felt like a lead weight as she started her shift. The hours passed like an eternity of torment. Val tried to work, but her thoughts remained with Mia. She raced back to the break room every hour, just as she had promised. Each time she found her daughter sleeping, and it seemed the fever was subsiding. But at 2 o'clock in the morning, when Val went back for the 5th time, the sofa was bare. The blanket was still there, warm to the touch, but Mia was not. Val felt her heart stop beating. She ran into the hallway, her eyes darting into every shadow, fighting the urge to scream so she would not attract any attention. She checked the bathrooms, the locker rooms, and the kitchen, but her daughter was nowhere in sight. At the same time, Mia had woken up at 1:30 in the morning. The fever had made her thirsty, and she was scared when she opened her eyes and did not see her mother. She left the room to find Val, but the long corridor of identical doors confused her. She kept walking, making a right turn, then a left. Faint music drifted from somewhere upstairs, and the dense smell of smoke and liquor made her feel sick. That is when she noticed a dark, cold stairwell leading down. Mia thought her mother might be down there, maybe cleaning a room she had not seen before. She descended the stairs one by one, her little hand braced against the damp wall, her heart hammering inside her chest. This basement was completely different from the rest of the casino. There were no plush red carpets or sparkling chandeliers. There was only gray concrete, rusted pipes crisscrossing the ceiling, and a musty smell mingled with something else Mia did not recognize, a kind of metallic, of dried blood. She followed the trail to the end of the hall, where a heavy steel door was open just a crack. A sliver of weak yellow light escaped from the gap. Mia gently pushed the door, stepped into the room, and stopped cold. In the dim space, a single flickering bulb lit a man slumped against the far wall. His arms and legs were bound in thick iron chains, bolted into the concrete. His clothes were shredded, and his face was a canvas of bruises and caked blood. A rough beard covered his strong jaw, but his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, burned with intensity the moment they saw the little girl in the doorway. Mia had no idea who she was looking at. She did not know this was Nathaniel Corsetti, the most feared mafia boss in all of Chicago. To her, he was just someone hurt, trapped, and alone. He looked like the stray dogs she saw in the alleys, chained up and left to waste away. The man looked at Mia, and in that moment, the coldness in his eyes shattered, as if a blade had just pierced his chest. He did not scream, he did not beg. He did not do anything a desperate man would do with a possible chance to escape. Instead, his voice was a low rasp, but it was solid. "Little girl, you need to leave this place now. It is not safe here." Mia did not move. She just stood there and tilted her head, her big brown eyes showing no fear at all. There was only curiosity and a kind of compassion that only children can hold on to in a cruel world. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "Are you crying?" Nathaniel Corsetti, the man who had ordered the end of countless rivals without a second thought, the man whose very name could make Chicago tremble, was suddenly lost. He did not know how to answer the question from a 5-year-old child. Before he could find the words, heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. They grew louder, mixed with the harsh laughter of 2 men. Nate's eyes shot wide. He looked from the door to Mia, his voice becoming urgent, but staying impossibly calm. "Hide behind that wooden crate," he ordered quickly, flicking his head toward the corner where a large box was sitting. "Do not make a single sound until they are gone. Whatever you see, you cannot come out. Do you understand me?" Mia nodded. The instinct to survive, learned over years in the slums, made her obey instantly. She scurried to the corner and tucked herself into a small ball behind the crate. She wrapped her arms around her knees, her heart hammering against her ribs. The steel door crashed open. 2 guards entered, bringing the reek of cheap liquor and cigarettes with them. One was tall and thin, the other was short and fat. Both had guns on their hips and cruel smiles on their faces. The tall one sneered at Nate. "Look at the great boss," he said, driving a heavy boot into Nate's gut. "What happens now? Do you have any idea where you are going tomorrow night? You are going to vanish. No one will ever find your body, and Carlo will be sitting on your throne." The short guard laughed and spit on Nate's face. "I heard you used to put people down without even blinking. Now look at you, a dog on a chain. This is beautiful." Nate remained silent. He just lifted his head, his gray eyes locking onto the men with a coldness so terrifying it was like he was memorizing their faces for a future reckoning. The guards laughed some more, kicked him again for their own amusement, and then finally left. Their footsteps faded away down the hall. Once the door shut and silence filled the room, Mia crept out from her hiding spot. Her eyes were red and filled with tears. "Are you okay?" she whispered. She moved closer, looking at the fresh bruises on his body. "Did those mean men hurt you badly?" Nate looked at her, and for the first time in 3 days of being held captive, he felt something besides rage and despair. This little girl reminded him of someone, a 4-year-old boy with eyes just like his, a boy who loved strawberry ice cream and dinosaurs, a boy who called him Dad first thing every morning, a boy who died in an explosion 3 years ago with his mother, leaving a hole in Nate's soul that could never be filled. "I am fine," he said, and his voice softened in a way that even he did not recognize. "You need to go find your mother now. Do not tell a single soul you were down here. Promise me." Mia nodded, but before she left, she stopped. She reached into the pocket of her pajama shirt and pulled out a small piece of candy in a red wrapper. It was the candy Abua Carmen had given her before she got sick. Mia placed it on the floor, right next to Nate's chained hand. "My mom says candy makes the hurt go away," Mia said, a tiny smile appearing on her face. "You should eat it. It will make you feel better." Then she spun around and ran, her small form vanishing through the steel doorway. Nate stared at the candy, his gray eyes shimmering. For the first time in 3 long years, tears tracked down his face. His son used to do the same thing. He would hand him a piece of candy after a long day of meetings and say, "Candy makes Daddy happier." He thought that part of him, the soft part, was dead and buried. It turned out it was only sleeping, waiting for a strange little girl to wake it up. Mia ran back through the dark corridor, up the stairs, and found her way back to the staff lounge with the practiced instinct of a child used to navigating the world alone. She had barely sat on the sofa when the door burst open. Val rushed in like a hurricane, her eyes wild with worry and terror. "Mia!" Val fell to her knees in front of her daughter. She grabbed Mia's shoulders, her voice a raw mix of relief and panic. "Where did you go? I have been looking all over for you. Do you have any idea how scared I was?" Mia looked up at her mother, her big eyes still reflecting the fear of what she had witnessed. "Mom," she whispered, "I was looking for you and I got lost. I went downstairs and I saw a man. The bad men have him locked in the basement. He was chained to the wall. Mom, he was like Mr. Johnson's dog that is always tied up in the yard and never gets any food." Val froze solid. The blood in her veins turned to ice. She knew about that basement. Every employee at the Black Diamond knew about it. It was a forbidden place. It was where traitors and troublemakers went and never came out. Nobody ever spoke of it. Nobody admitted it was real. And nobody ever dared to go down there without a direct order. "You cannot tell anyone about this," Val said, her voice so sharp it made Mia flinch. "Do you understand me? Not one single person. This is a very dangerous place, and if they find out you were down there, if they discover what you saw—" She could not bring herself to finish the thought. She could not imagine the consequences. "But Mom," Mia said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, "he is going to die. I heard the bad men. They said tomorrow night he will disappear. They hit him, Mom. They kicked him right in his stomach. And he did not cry, but I know it hurt him so much." Val wanted to cover her ears. She wanted to pretend she had not heard a word. She wanted to grab her daughter and run away from this place and never look back. But then Mia continued, her voice barely there. "He protected me, Mom. When the bad men came, he told me where to hide. He was all chained up, and he was still worried about me. Mom, you always tell me that good people are supposed to help other people. He is a good person." Val looked down at her daughter, at those honest eyes so full of trust in the world, and she felt something inside her break. This child still believed in good. She believed in justice. She believed in all the things that Val had given up on a long time ago. How could she explain to her that life was not fair? That good people died all the time? That sometimes the only way to survive was to close your eyes and look the other way? That night, after Val took Mia home and tucked her into bed next to Abua Carmen, she returned to the casino. Her mind was a storm. She was not sure what she was doing as she walked to the area near the basement. Georgie, the old jailer, was sitting on a wooden chair, reading a newspaper under a single dim bulb. Georgie had worked here since before Val was even born. He was one of the very few people who treated her like a person instead of a ghost. He never judged her for her past. He never looked at her with hunger or with scorn. He just gave a simple nod whenever she passed by, as if she was worthy of respect just like anyone else. "Georgie," Val said, her voice so quiet she had to say it again. "The man in the basement. Who is he?" Georgie looked up from his paper. His old eyes were sharp, probing, like he was trying to read her very soul. "You should not be asking that," he said. "You should not know. Who? You should just do your cleaning and keep your head down like you always do." "I know," Val said. "But I have to know. Please." Georgie watched her for a long moment. Then he let out a heavy sigh. He folded his newspaper, and his voice dropped low, as if he was sharing a secret that could get them both killed. "That is Nathaniel Corsetti, the boss, the man who owns this casino, these streets, this entire city. 3 nights ago, he was ambushed right here in his own office. All of his guards were taken out. Alio, nobody knows if he is alive or dead. The one who did it is Carlo Corsetti, his cousin. That snake teamed up with the Vulovs, the Russian outfit, to steal the whole operation." Val felt the world tilt under her. She knew the name Nathaniel Corsetti. Everyone in Chicago did. He was the monster in the stories that mothers told their kids to make them behave, the dark presence behind every shady deal in the city. But she also recalled something else, a whisper she had heard years ago about him taking down a human trafficking operation and making sure anyone who hurt women on his turf paid a heavy price. "Tomorrow night, they are going to finish him," Georgie continued, his voice thick with bitterness. "Then they will say he disappeared on a business trip. Carla will take his place, and nobody will ever know what really happened." "Why are you telling me this?" Val asked, her own voice trembling. Georgie looked at her, a flicker of desperate hope suddenly appearing in his old eyes. "Because I gave my word to his father, because my hands are tied. But you are invisible here. Nobody pays any attention to you. Sometimes, the people no one sees are the only ones who can do what the powerful cannot." Val got back to her apartment as the first light of dawn was breaking through the sky. But sleep was impossible. She lay in bed next to Mia, studying her daughter's peaceful, angelic face while her thoughts raced, replaying everything Georgie had told her. Nathaniel Corsetti, the man who ran all of Chicago, was chained up in that basement and was going to be killed the next night. That was not her concern. She was just a janitor, a nobody, an unseen woman with no influence, no money, and nothing in the world but the little girl sleeping soundly beside her. She did not owe this man a thing. She had no cause to interfere. She had no cause to endanger her own life, and Mia's, for a complete stranger, no matter who he was. And yet, every time she shut her eyes, she pictured Mia telling her about the man who had warned her to hide when the guards approached. The man who was in chains, but still found a way to protect a child he had never met. Then, her own history came flooding back to her. It was a past she had spent years trying to bury. Val recalled the winter evening 5 years before, when she was pregnant. Rico Santino had beaten her and tossed her onto the pavement like she was a stray animal. She remembered kneeling on the frozen ground, with blood streaming from a cut on her head, pleading with people for assistance. Nobody paused, not even one person. They would glance at her and then turn their heads, quickening their pace as if her pain were some kind of disease. She remembered going door to door in the neighborhood, begging for a place to stay for the night. Every door was slammed in her face, followed by curses. "You had it coming. Do not bring your problems here." She almost died on that night. She and the baby inside her were close to death. If Abuela Carmen had not been walking by and rescued her, she would be gone. A total stranger who knew nothing about her, nothing of her history, yet opened her home. She gave her a bed, food, and a reason to hope. It took just one person, only a single individual who did not turn away, and it was enough for her to survive. Val's eyes opened as she looked up at the ceiling, which was marked by wet spots. She considered how she and Mia would not exist if Abuela Carmen had just ignored her like the others. She thought about how many people had lost their lives simply because nobody offered them a hand. She thought about the man in the basement who had been betrayed by his own family, now waiting to die alone in the dark. He was the head of the Mafia, a man with blood on his hands, a terror to the entire city. But he was also the one who had shielded her daughter when there was no need to. He did it while he was in chains, awaiting his own death. I owe him nothing, Val whispered to herself in the darkness. But then she heard Mia's voice in her head. It was the voice of a 5-year-old who still saw the good in the world. Mom always says that good people are supposed to help other people. Val shut her eyes as tears soaked her pillow. She had taught her daughter that lesson, but now she was thinking about looking away, just like the people who had abandoned her 5 years ago. Could she turn into one of them? Could she look Mia in the eyes each day? Could she teach her about goodness and bravery, all while knowing she had let a man die because she was scared? When the sun finally rose over Chicago, as faint light streamed through the grimy window, Val knew what she had to do. She would help Nathaniel Corsetti. She was not doing it because of who he was, but because she refused to be the kind of person who looked away. It was the most dangerous decision she had ever made. It might have been the last one she would ever get to make. But at the very least, she could look at her reflection without hating what she saw. That evening, Val told Georgie she needed to go to the basement to clean. The old jailer watched her for a long time, his experienced eyes seeing something in her expression. In the end, he said nothing. He just gave her the key and a nod. Val carried a small paper bag. Inside was some bread she had purchased with the very last of her coins. She also had a small piece of cheese and a bottle of fresh water. It was not a lot, but it was all she could carry without making anyone suspicious. The sound of her steps echoed in the dark basement hall. Her heart was beating so forcefully she thought it was loud enough for anyone to hear. When she got to the steel door, she paused, took a long breath, then she pushed it open and went in. Nathaniel Corsetti looked up when he heard the noise. His gray eyes shone in the shadows like a trapped animal's. But when he saw that it was not a guard standing in front of him, his expression changed. A look of curiosity and surprise appeared on his face. "You are the little girl's mother," he said, his voice rough from not having any water. Val stood frozen, surprised that he knew. "How did you know that?" "You have the same eyes as her," Nate answered, his gray eyes fixed on her. "And I saw you 3 nights ago when you walked past this room with a bucket. You heard me make a sound, but you did not stop. You did not look inside. You were not curious. You were terrified. People who are that afraid often have a great deal to lose." Val moved closer and placed the paper bag on the floor next to him. "My daughter told me you protected her when the guards came. I am here to repay that debt, and that is all." Nate glanced at the bag but did not reach for it. "Do you know who I am? Nathaniel Corsetti, the boss. The man who owns this casino and this whole city." "Do you know what I have done to earn that title?" Nate asked. His voice was not proud or menacing. It was a test to see if she would flee. "How many people have I killed with my own hands? How many families have been ruined because of me? Are you aware of those things?" Val did not move back. Her dark brown eyes met his gray ones without flinching. "I do not care if you are a saint or a devil. You protected my child when you had no reason to. You did it while you were in chains, waiting for your own death. For me, that is all that matters." A heavy silence filled the space between them, but it was not awkward. It was like two strangers trying to understand one another in the dark. Finally, Nate leaned forward. His chained hand shook as he reached for the bottle of water. He drank like a man who was dying of thirst. Water spilled down his rough beard. Then he took the bread and ate it slowly, as if he were trying to commit the taste of life to memory. "They will kill me tomorrow night," he said after he swallowed the final piece. "I know. You cannot save me. You will die as well if they discover you. I know." Then, why? Val sat down on the cold concrete floor across from him. She did not seem to mind the dirt or the dried blood, as if she was accustomed to being in places others would avoid. "Because nobody ever saved me when I needed it," she said. Her voice was quiet and firm. There was no pity in it, just the raw truth. 5 years ago, I was beaten and thrown onto the street in the middle of winter. I was pregnant and covered in blood. I knelt on the sidewalk and begged people to help me, but they walked past as if I did not exist. I knocked on every single door, and every single one was slammed in my face. I was so close to dying that night. My child and I were so close to dying." She stopped and took a long breath. Only one person stopped, an old woman who did not know who I was or what I had done. But she saved me. Just one person, and that is why I am still alive today. Nate looked at her, and for the first time, the coldness in his gray eyes was gone. They became deep and full of pain, as if he recognized his own story and hers. "What is your name?" he asked, and his voice softened in a way that surprised even him. "Valentina, but people call me Val." "Valentina," he said again, as if he were etching the name into his mind. "That is a beautiful name. It means strong and healthy. It appears my mother chose it well. She wanted me to have more strength than she did. She had no idea how much strength life would demand from me." A smile touched Nate's lips, the first in many days. It was strained but genuine, and in that quiet moment, two souls abandoned by the world saw each other. They were not a crime boss and a cleaning lady, but two human beings who had hit rock bottom and were still fighting their way back up. After that night, Val started doing something she never would have imagined. She started observing. For years at the Black Diamond, she had perfected the art of being invisible. Head down, eyes lowered, she heard nothing and saw nothing. She knew nothing. It was the only way she had found to survive in that place. But now she saw that her invisibility could be turned into a weapon. Nobody notices the janitor on her knees scrubbing the floor. Nobody thinks to lower their voice when a ghost is pushing a cleaning cart down the hall. Nobody suspects that the ears hidden under that tightly pulled hair are catching every single word. The first night after she met Nate, Val requested to clean the third floor, which was where Carlo Corsetti kept his office. She made her way there at 2 a.m, long after Carlo had departed from a late meeting. He left behind glasses still containing liquor and ashtrays piled high with cigarette butts. Val cleaned deliberately, her gaze scanning his desk, looking for anything that might be useful. She spotted handwritten notes, numbers, names, and addresses. She could not make sense of it all, but she pulled out her old phone, the one she had purchased at a pawn shop for $20, and took pictures of everything. Her hands trembled as she touched the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs as if trying to escape, but she did not stop. On the second night, she overheard something much more critical. Carlo was having a meeting in VIP room 7, the same room Val was typically tasked with cleaning each night. She got there earlier than usual and slipped into the cleaning supply cabinet in the corner. There was a thin crack in the door, just wide enough for her to see through. She had to wait for almost an hour in the cramped, dark space. The chemical fumes stung her nose, and her legs grew numb from standing still, but she did not shift. Then, they arrived. Carlo Corsetti walked in with two men Val did not recognize. Their English was thick with a heavy Russian accent. Val knew instantly they were soldiers for Dmitry Vulov, the Russian Mafia leader Georgie had told her about. "Tomorrow night, Corsetti dies," Carlo said, his voice flat, as if talking about the weather instead of the murder of his own cousin. "We take him to the South Warehouse. We make it look like a fire. No evidence, no body, nothing." One of the Russians grunted. "And after that, I take over the Corsetti Empire," Carlo continued. Vulov gets the weapons routes and the northern territories. The rest is mine. That was our agreement. Do not get greedy. Vulov wants to be sure Nathaniel is really dead, the other Russian said, his voice carrying a threat. He has done business with Corsetti for 10 years. He does not like surprises. He will be dead, Carlos snarled. I have waited for this for years. That bastard inherited it all while I, the older cousin, was left with scraps. My father served the Corsetti family his whole life and died with nothing, all while Nathaniel sat on a throne like a prince. It is time for a change. Val pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking so violently she almost dropped it. She activated the recorder. She captured everything, every word, every laugh, every single detail of the plot to eliminate Nate. They discussed the time, the place, the people involved, and how they would torch the warehouse to destroy any evidence. They talked about announcing that Nathaniel had disappeared during a business trip, and how Carlo would step in to lead as the proper heir. The meeting went on for nearly an hour. When they finally left, Val stayed hidden in the cabinet for another 10 minutes, hardly daring to breathe. She waited until she was absolutely certain she was alone. She stepped out on trembling legs, her clothes soaked through with sweat. But in her hand, she held proof. She was holding a weapon, something that could change the entire game. That night, at 4 in the morning, she went to the basement to see Nate as she had promised, carrying bread and water like always. This time, however, she brought something far more valuable. She knelt down next to him, unlocked her phone, and played the audio file. In the damp darkness of his cell, Carlo Corsetti's voice echoed, clear and cold and cruel, as he detailed the plan to murder his own cousin. Nate listened, and his gray eyes grew darker. It was not with despair, but with something much more terrifying. It was the rage of a wounded animal that had finally identified its attacker. When the recording finished, he looked at Val. In his eyes, she no longer saw a prisoner awaiting death. She saw a boss, calculating, planning, and preparing to fight back. After hearing the recording, Nate told Val what he needed. Alio Vargas, my bodyguard. The night they took me, they shot him 3 times. I do not know if he survived, but if he did, he will know how to reach the men who are still loyal. Find Theodore Walsh, my lawyer. If anyone is able to help, it is Theo. Val just looked at him. She wanted to ask him how a janitor like her was supposed to locate a fugitive bodyguard and a high society lawyer. But she did not ask. She simply nodded her head and left. She had learned that in this world, nobody comes to help those who just wait. The only ones who make it are those who find their own path. The next day, Val started using her old contacts, the ones she thought she had left behind with her past. During her 3 years at Rico Santino's nightclub, she had crossed paths with all kinds of people. Drunk men who loved to tell their secrets to the girls, boastful men who talked about what they knew to seem important, men who owed her for her silence, because she never repeated the things they confessed in the dead of night. She went to one of them, an information dealer named Mickey, a man who knew everything that went on in Chicago's underworld. Mickey's eyes went wide with shock when she showed up. He never expected to see her alive, much less walking up to him for a favor. I need to know where Alio Vargas is, Val said. Her voice was cold and steady. She was not the same scared girl he knew from 5 years ago. I do not know, Mickey said, but his eyes shifted away. Yes, you do, Val insisted, and you will tell me, because you still owe me. Do you remember that night you were drunk and told me about your side deal with the Vulovs? If word of that got out, how long do you think you would last? Mickey turned pale, and 5 minutes later, Val had an address. Alio was holed up in an abandoned hospital on the west side, taken in and hidden by a former prostitute. When Val found him, she saw a man on a broken cot, his chest covered in bloody bandages. His face was white from blood loss, but a fire lit up in his eyes when he heard Nate was alive. Alio cried. The hardened man who had followed Nate since they were young wept openly, tears streaming down his scarred face. I thought he was dead, he choked out, his voice cracking. I thought I failed to protect him. Alio gave Val the phone number for Theodore Walsh and the address of his law firm, plus a list of loyal bodyguards who were in hiding around the city. He also told her the locations of safe houses that only Nate's inner circle knew about. Val committed it all to memory and then she left, leaving Alio with some food and medicine she had purchased with the last of her savings. Finding Theodore Walsh was more difficult than she anticipated. He was a famous lawyer. His office was in a wealthy part of downtown, not the kind of place someone like Val could just walk into without being thrown out. So she waited. She stood outside the building for 4 hours in the freezing cold, until he finally came out alone at 9 in the evening. "Mr. Walsh," she said, stepping from the shadows. He jumped, his hand moving inside his coat as if for a weapon. "Who are you? What is it you want?" "I come on behalf of Nathaniel Corsetti," Val said quickly. "He is alive. He needs your help." Theo's eyes widened. He glanced around as if worried someone was watching, then he pulled Val into a dark alley. "What are you talking about? Nate is alive? How can you know that? Who are you?" Val gave him her phone and played the recording of the meeting between Carlo and the Russians. Theo listened, his expression changing from disbelief to horror and then to pure rage. When the audio ended, he stood frozen for a long moment, his hands clenched into tight fists. "My God," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Carlo. It was Carlo. I should have known." "What should you have known?" Val asked. Theo looked at her, and his old eyes were filled with anguish. "Nate's wife and son, Isabel and the boy, they died in a car bomb 3 years ago. Did you know that? No one ever found out who did it. Nate spent 3 years searching. He spent millions trying to hunt down who killed his family, but he never found a single lead." He stopped and swallowed hard. "But now, after what you just played for me, knowing how Carlo planned all of this, knowing how long he has been tied to Vulov, it all connects. Carlo killed them. He killed Isabel and the boy to weaken Nate, to set the stage for today." Val felt the blood run cold in her veins. An image of Mia flashed in her mind. The thought of someone killing her daughter as part of a power play made her understand the world's cruelty on a much deeper level. She also understood the pain Nate had been carrying. It was the pain of a father who lost his child and never even knew who his enemy was. Until now. That night, as Val went down to the basement with this new information, she had no idea how she was going to tell him. How could she tell a man that the person who killed his wife and child was his own flesh and blood, someone he had trusted for so many years? She sat across from Nate and looked into the gray eyes that had become so familiar. She could see a tiny spark of hope inside them. It was the hope that she had good news, that the rescue plan was going ahead. But Val did not have good news. She had the truth, and sometimes the truth is crueler than death. "I found Alio," she started, her voice gentle, as if she were afraid to break something. "He is alive. He is badly hurt, but he is going to make it. I also found Theodore Walsh." Nate nodded, and his eyes brightened. "Good. That is very good. With Alio and Theo we can. There is one more thing." Val cut him off, and she saw Nate pause, hearing something in her tone. It was a weight that could not be concealed. "What is it?" Val took a deep breath. "Theo told me about your wife and son. He told me about the car bomb 3 years ago." Nate became completely still. His gray eyes grew dark, like the sky before a thunderstorm. He did not say a word, but his entire body tensed up like a drawn break. Theo started. "For 3 years you hunted for the killer and found nothing." Val's voice shook as she went on. "But after what I overheard in Carlo's meeting, how he planned everything for so long, his connections to Vulov," she didn't have to say the rest. Nate understood. She watched the truth hit him like a physical blow. She saw every piece click into place in his mind, creating a terrible image he never wanted to witness. "Carlo," he breathed, his voice so flat it was chilling. "Carlo murdered Isabel. Carlo murdered my son." It was not a question. It was a final judgment. Val could only nod, lost for words in the presence of such profound pain. Nate was perfectly still, his gray eyes staring at nothing, and she watched him crumble from the inside, collapsing piece by piece like a building being demolished. He was only 4 years old, Nate said, his voice cracking like thin ice. He loved strawberry ice cream. He loved dinosaurs. Every single morning he would run into my room, jump on my bed, and yell, "Daddy, get up!" He called Carlo Uncle Carlo. He adored Uncle Carlo because he always brought him new toys. Tears began to flow down Nate's face. They were the first tears Val had ever seen him cry for himself, not for someone else. He wept without a sound, without a single sob. There were only tears, and the pure agony of a father who had lost his entire world and had only just discovered his true enemy. Val did not know what she was doing when she leaned in closer, when her hand covered his, still locked in chains, when she squeezed it tight, as if she could transfer her own strength into him. She said nothing, because no words could ever touch a pain this deep. She just sat with him in the silent darkness. They stayed that way for a long time. It could have been minutes, or it could have been an hour. Val lost all track of time. But then she felt the hand under hers stop trembling and grow steady. It went from weak to powerful. When she looked up, Nate's gray eyes were no longer a void of sorrow. They were burning with a cold, ruthless fire that was more terrifying than anything she had ever witnessed. "I will kill him," Nate said. His voice was no longer broken or unsteady. It held only the cold finality of a death sentence already delivered. "I will take him apart, piece by piece, and I will make him plead for death before I grant it to him." Hearing those words did not frighten Val. It should have, but it didn't. She knew exactly how he felt. If anyone had done that to Mia, she would say the very same thing. She would turn into a monster to get her revenge. "First, you have to get out of this place," she told him. "You have to make it through tomorrow night." Nate turned his head to look at her. And in that moment, something in his gaze changed. A trace of softness appeared in all that fury. A tiny spark of light in the overwhelming dark. "Why are you still here, Valentina?" he asked. "You could have left a long time ago." Val looked at him, a man in chains, covered in his own blood, who had just been told the most brutal truth of his life. "Because sometimes," she said gently, "the people this world throws away have to look out for each other." The plan came together over the next 24 hours. It was a desperate race against time, and Val refused to even consider failure. Alio, still recovering, was able to reach 5 loyal bodyguards who were still in hiding around the city. These were men ready to die for their boss. Theo secured a car, waiting at the casino's rear exit, and prepared a hidden bunker on the city's edge. It was a place Carlo knew nothing about, built in secret by Nate's father decades ago. Their success depended entirely on perfect timing, on flawless precision, and on one old man who had pledged his life to the true Corsetti family. That night, Carlo threw a massive party on the casino's top floors to celebrate what he was calling his transfer of power. He had invited his allies, his business partners, and anyone he wanted to impress with his new authority. Upstairs, the music was deafening, filled with laughter and the sound of champagne glasses. Down in the basement, a rescue mission was unfolding in absolute silence. Val got to the casino at 10 o'clock in the evening, just like always. She wore her usual janitor uniform and pushed her cleaning cart down hallways where nobody gave her a second look. She had done this 1,000 times before, and tonight seemed no different to anyone watching. But hidden in her pocket, her phone was on silent, waiting for the message from Alio confirming that the car was in position at the back door. At 11:30, the text arrived. Val made her way down to the basement, her heart beating so loud she thought it would burst. Georgie was there waiting for her. His old face was rigid with tension, but his eyes shone with a kind of relief, like he had been waiting for this moment for years. "We need to be fast," he whispered, guiding Val toward Nate's cell. He took out a ring of keys. His hand was shaking just a little as he found the right one and turned the lock on the heavy steel door. Inside, Nate was already on his feet, his gray eyes flashing in the dim light as he saw them. Georgie went inside and knelt down, beginning to unlock the shackles on Nate's wrists and ankles. "Boss," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am so sorry. I should have done this earlier. I should have—" "You did more than enough, Georgie," Nate said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You served my family for 40 years. My father would have been proud of you." The chains hit the concrete floor with a loud metallic crash. For the first time in days, Nate was free. He swayed on his feet, his legs unsteady after being chained for so long, but Val moved quickly to steady him, letting him lean his weight on her shoulder. "We need to leave," she urged. "Emilio is waiting by the back exit." They moved down the dark hallway, with Georgie in the lead and Val supporting Nate. Every step was careful, like they were walking across a frozen lake. They had almost reached the stairs leading up to the main floor when their entire plan fell apart. The door at the far end of the hall was thrown open, and a figure appeared, blocking their escape. It was Rico Santino. His eyes went wide when he saw them, then narrowed with fury when he recognized Val. "You," he spat, his voice filled with shock and pure hatred. "You old piece of trash. You are still alive, and you have the nerve to—" His eyes darted from Val to Nate, then to Georgie, and understanding washed over his face. "You are helping Corsetti get away. You! A cheap whore I threw out like garbage." Val froze for a second, as the memories of 5 years ago hit her like a punch. The nights of violence, the beatings, the shame of being thrown onto the street like an animal. But she was not that girl anymore. She did not tremble in front of him this time. "Step aside, Rico," she said. Her voice was cold and solid. "This is not your fight." Rico let out a cruel laugh, the same laugh that had haunted her nightmares for years. "Who do you think you are? What do you possibly think you can do?" He started to reach into his coat pocket, where Val knew he kept a gun. But before his fingers could touch the weapon, Nate moved with a speed that was impossible to follow. Even after days of being tortured, even with his legs still weak from the shackles, Nate was still the Mafia boss who had won countless wars. He launched himself at Rico, one hand clamping around his throat while the other tore the gun from his pocket. Rico gagged, his eyes bulging in terror, but he managed one last act before Nate shattered his windpipe. He slammed the alarm button on the phone clipped to his belt. It was the same alarm that every one of Carlo's men carried. A piercing siren screamed through the casino, destroying the silence in the basement. And in that instant, Val knew that everything had just become 1,000 times harder. The shriek of the alarm echoed through the building, ripping through the basement corridors like a scream from hell. "Nate," he tightened his hands on Rico's neck, choking the life out of him until the man fell limp. Nate then tossed the body to the ground like a bag of trash. He took Rico's pistol, checked the ammunition, and faced Val and Georgie with the eyes of a soldier preparing for war. He commanded them to run toward the eastern emergency exit where Alio was waiting. They fled, with Georgie navigating the labyrinth of hallways he had memorized over 40 years of working there. The heavy sound of boots echoed behind them. They heard shouting and the click of guns being readied. Val knew Carlos's men were swarming the basement, like a pack of wolves closing in on their kill. They took a left turn, then a right, and another left. Val became completely disoriented. She could only follow Georgie, trying to keep her footing on the slick stone floor. Gunshots erupted behind them. Bullets flew past their heads and struck the walls, showering them with concrete dust. Nate spun around and shot back. He fired 2 rounds, then 3 more. Val heard a man scream and hit the ground, but she did not dare to look back. "The exit is just ahead," Georgie yelled, his voice strained from his age and the effort. Only 20 more meters. They ran harder than they ever had in their lives. Val felt a fire in her lungs. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, but she refused to stop. Mia was waiting for her. Her daughter was safe at home with Abua Carmen, and she had to make it back. She had to return to her little girl. A steel door came into view. Georgie threw himself at it, turned the knob, and a sliver of outside light cut through the darkness, a symbol of freedom. Just then, 3 of Carlo's soldiers appeared from a connecting hall, cutting off their escape. Nate shot one of them down, but the other 2 found cover and started firing back without pause. They were cornered. The exit was right there, but they would be gunned down if they took a single step toward it. "Go!" Georgie said suddenly, his tone surprisingly steady in the middle of the gunfire and mayhem. "I will delay them." Nate looked at him, his gray eyes wide with disbelief. "Georgie, no, boss. No." Georgie interrupted him. For the first time all evening, a smile appeared on his face, the calm expression of a man who knew his time had come. "I am an old man. I have lived my life. But you have a kingdom to reclaim, and enemies to make pay." He then looked at Val, his smile becoming even kinder. "And you have people who depend on you." Before Nate could object, Georgie sprang from their hiding spot and ran toward the 2 gunmen, yelling to attract their attention. "Go! Leave now!" he shouted. This time, Nate knew he had no other option. He seized Val's hand, dragged her toward the exit, and they crashed through the heavy door just as more gunshots echoed behind them. Then, there was silence. Val wanted to go back, to see what had happened to Georgie, but Nate would not let her. He pulled her down the dark alleyway behind the casino, where a black sport utility vehicle was waiting with the engine running. Alio sat in the driver's seat, his face still pale from his own recent injuries, but his eyes were bright when he saw Nate. "Boss!" he yelled, pushing the door open. "Get inside!" They leaped into the car, and Alio slammed on the accelerator. The vehicle sped away, disappearing into the night. From the casino behind them, the sound of gunfire and alarms grew fainter and fainter. Val sat in the back, struggling to catch her breath, her skin cold and damp with sweat. She realized she was clutching Nate's hand, or maybe he was holding hers. She could no longer tell. She gazed out the window as the streetlights blurred into streaks of color, and she thought about Georgie, the old man who gave his life so they could escape. "Georgie," she whispered, her voice cracking. Nate remained silent, but she felt his grip tighten. When she looked over at him, she could see the moisture in his gray eyes, reflecting the dim light. "He was the last person loyal to my father," Nate said, his voice low and full of pain. "He gave the Corsetti family 40 years of his life, and he died with a smile because he knew he had honored his promise." A profound silence filled the car, heavy with sorrow and loss. Val did not know what to say. She simply held Nate's hand, offering her presence so he would know he was not by himself. Alio drove through the dark Chicago streets, heading for the city limits and a secure location where they could regroup and plan their next move. But Val was not thinking about any of that. Her mind was on Mia, her daughter at home with Abua Carmen. She had to get back to her child immediately. "Mia," she said with urgency. "My daughter, I must go to her." Nate looked at her and gave a single nod. "Alio, take us to her place first." The car pulled up to the old apartment building on the south side, and Val was out the door before it came to a complete stop. She sprinted through the main door, where the lock had been broken for years, and took the stairs 3 at a time. Her heart hammered against her ribs, feeling like it would break free. Something was wrong. She knew it deep inside, a primal mother's instinct that required no proof. When she got to the 3rd floor and stood before Abua Carmen's apartment, number 37, Val stopped cold. The door was shattered, ripped from its hinges, with splintered wood littering the hall. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, no, no." She burst into the room, and her entire world fell apart. The small apartment had been torn to pieces. Furniture was flipped over, and possessions were scattered everywhere. Abua Carmen was on the floor, not moving. Blood trickled from a long gash on her forehead, turning her silver hair a dark red. Val fell to her knees beside the woman, her shaking hands searching for a pulse. She was breathing. She was still alive. But Mia was gone. Val searched the apartment, screaming her daughter's name. Her voice grew more desperate. "Mia, Mia, where are you?" But there was no reply. There was only a dreadful silence and the strong, metallic smell of blood hanging in the air. Nate entered the apartment with Alio right behind him, and they both stopped in shock at the scene. Nate surveyed the chaos, his gray eyes scanning the room like a predator searching for threats. His eyes landed on a small table near the window. A single sheet of paper was placed there, set out so it could not be missed. He crossed the room, picked it up, and his expression hardened as he read it. "Val," he called out, his voice strained. Val rushed to his side, grabbed the paper from his hand, and read the words, each one piercing her like a bullet. "If you want to see the girl again, bring me Corsetti's life. Southern Warehouse, 12 midnight tomorrow. Come by yourself, Vulov." The note fell from Val's hand, floating to the ground like a dead leaf. She stood frozen, unable to move, to breathe, to even think. Mia, her daughter, the 5-year-old child who was her entire world, was in the clutches of a monster. A man who killed without remorse. A Russian mafia leader known for torturing his victims before ending their lives. Val's legs gave out and she collapsed. A raw scream tore from her throat, the sound of a mother who had just had her heart ripped out. "Mia, my baby. They have my baby." Tears poured down her cheeks, her entire body shaking without control. She screamed over and over until her voice gave out, leaving only ragged, choking sobs. Nate knelt down next to her. His strong hands gripped her shoulders, turning her to face him. "Val," he said. His voice was stern, but it held a deeper emotion, a pain that he knew all too well. "Look at me. Look at me." Val raised her head. Her brown eyes were red and swollen from crying, her face a mask of pure anguish. "They will hurt my little girl," she said, her voice completely broken. They will not get the chance." Nate interrupted, his gray eyes now burning with a fury she had never witnessed. It was the fire of the man who had once controlled all of Chicago. It was the fire of a father who had also lost a child and understood her pain perfectly. "I give you my word, Val, I will get her back. I will eliminate anyone who even thinks of harming her, and I will bring her home to you, even if it is the last thing I do." "You do not get it," Val sobbed, grabbing his coat as if he were her only hope in a storm. "You do not know what they will do to my daughter." "I do understand," Nate said, his voice becoming quiet and raw, like an old wound that had been ripped open again. "I understand better than anyone. I lost my own son, and I will not let you lose your daughter. Not because of me, not tonight, not ever." He rose to his feet and looked at Alio. His gray eyes were no longer those of an escaped convict, but of a king readying his army for war. "Get everyone on the phone. Call Theo. Call Bobby Sullivan. Call every man who is still loyal. We are not waiting for tomorrow. We are ending this tonight." Within 2 hours, the safe house on the edge of Chicago had been transformed into a military command post. Alio reached out to all their remaining allies, and they began to arrive, one after another, moving like shadows in the darkness. 5 bodyguards who had been with Nate from the very beginning. These were men who had survived the attack the night he was taken and had been in hiding, waiting for this moment. Theodore Walsh showed up with a briefcase full of critical intelligence on Volkov's holdings, which included the Southern Warehouse where Mia was being kept. Detective Bobby Sullivan, the officer whose daughter Nate had rescued from traffickers years before, provided detailed blueprints of the location and information on how many guards Volkov typically had on duty. The bunker was crowded with people, and the air was thick with the smell of gun oil, sweat, and rising tension. Nate stood in the middle of the room, in front of a large map laid out on a table. Val watched him, and felt like she was seeing a completely different person. This was not the broken man in chains she had found in a dark cell. He was not the prisoner waiting for death to whom she had brought food and water. This was Nathaniel Corsetti, the true boss of Chicago, the man the entire city was afraid of. And now she finally saw why. He issued commands with icy precision, assigning roles like a general planning a battle. His sharp gaze moved over every person, instantly measuring their strengths and their weaknesses. Volkov has about 20 gunmen protecting the warehouse, Bobby Sullivan reported, pointing to a spot on the map. They work in rotating shifts. His men were deployed in shifts of 8, with 4 stationed outside and another 4 inside. In his penthouse, Carlo was already celebrating a victory he thought was his, completely unaware Nate was free. "We're splitting into 2 units," Nate announced. "The first unit will hit the warehouse to get the girl. The second unit will breach the penthouse and capture Carlo alive. I'm leading the first team." Alio spoke, his voice strained with worry. "Boss, you are not fully healed. Those injuries of yours. It does not matter." Nate's response was sharp, shutting down any protest. "Vulov has that girl because of what I did. Her mother put her life on the line for me, and now her daughter is the one paying. I will either bring her home myself, or I will die in the attempt." The planning session continued for another hour. They reviewed every possible detail and planned for every outcome. As the others left to get their weapons and equipment, Val sat frozen in a corner. Her gaze was distant, her thoughts consumed by Mia and the horrors her little girl might be facing. Nate approached and sat down opposite her, and they shared a long, heavy silence. "You need to stay here," he said at last. "You will be safe in this place. I will get Mia and bring her back to you." Val raised her head, her brown eyes locking with his gray ones. "I need to go with you." "No. That would be a death sentence. I do not care." Nate stared at her, and she watched his jaw clench. A fire ignited in his eyes, an emotion she could not decipher. "I care," he said, his voice low. "What do you imagine I am fighting for tonight? My business? The money? The power?" He leaned in, erasing the space that separated them. "I am fighting for you. For the girl. Because after 3 long years, I finally have a purpose for living that is not driven by revenge." Val was stunned, finding it hard to process his words. "What you did, I am not sure what to call it," Nate went on, his voice hoarse, as if the words were pulled from a part of him he had locked away years ago. "When you came into that cell with just bread and water, you saw me as a person, not a monster. When you took my hand the night I found out about Isabel and my son, something inside me shifted. I believed that part of me was buried with my family 3 years ago. It was just dormant, waiting for someone to bring it back." He lifted his hand to her face, touching her cheek. Val felt the heat from his palm seep into her chilled skin. "I will get Mia back. I promise you. But you must remain here. You need to survive, because if you die, then even if I win this fight, I will have lost everything that matters." Tears streamed down Val's face. She was not sure if they were from her fear for Mia, from the impact of Nate's confession, or from a mix of both. She grabbed his hand, pressing it against her cheek and holding on as if it were her only anchor in a dark, churning ocean. "You must come back," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Do you understand me? You must bring Mia home, and you must come back with her. You are not allowed to die." Nate offered a smile, the first she had ever seen on him that was not touched by pain or bitterness. It was a true smile, so gentle and warm it made her heart ache. "I will try," he promised. "For you." He then stood up and rejoined his men. Val watched him leave, praying to any god who might be listening that this would not be the last time she saw him alive. The southern warehouse was situated at the edge of a derelict industrial park. A huge red brick structure with broken windows stood surrounded by overgrown weeds. The night was moonless. A deep darkness covered the area like a heavy shroud. This was the exact cover Nate required. His team advanced from 3 different points, moving with a ghostly silence. They eliminated the external guards before any alarm could be sounded. Nate commanded the primary assault group, pistol ready, his gray eyes scanning the darkness with predatory focus. He had executed missions like this hundreds of times, taking down enemy forts and leaving with blood on his hands. But this night was different. This was not about gaining power or money. This was for a 5-year-old girl who offered him candy while he was chained to a wall. It was for her mother, who rescued him when he had been abandoned by everyone else. They stormed the warehouse from a back entrance. The quiet was shattered by gunfire. Men shouted. Boots thudded on the ground. Bullets ripped into concrete and tore through bodies. Nate fired with cold efficiency. Each shot was precise, each one a kill, as he moved between rusted shelves and forgotten shipping crates like a force of destruction. Alio was right beside him, protecting his flank. His own wound was not completely healed, but he fought with the ferocity of a man with nothing left to lose. They pressed further into the building, leaving a trail of bodies and spreading pools of blood on the concrete floor. Finally, they broke into the central chamber, a massive open area in the core of the warehouse. Dmitry Vulov was waiting there, a cruel smile on his face. He was about 50, with short-cropped silver hair and a scarred face that told stories of countless wars. Next to him, a subordinate held Mia, with a blade held firmly to her neck. Val could see the little girl shaking, tears marking paths on her dirty cheeks, yet she made no sound, as if she understood that screaming would not help her. "Corsetti!" Vulov greeted him, his voice heavy with a Russian accent and dripping with scorn. "You are earlier than I anticipated. I expected you to wait for our meeting tomorrow night." "Let the girl go, and she can be anywhere you want," Nate retorted, his voice like ice. His gray eyes remained fixed on Mia and the knife at her throat. Mia saw him then, and her wide eyes looked up, a tiny spark of hope flickering in her eyes. "Uncle Candy," she whispered, her voice still trembling, but the terror was gone. The words hit Nate like a fist to the gut. Memories of his own son came rushing back. A 4-year-old boy who used to call him silly nicknames just like that. A child who was now in the ground because of his family's betrayal. He could not let that happen again. He refused to let it happen again. "What is it you want?" Nate asked, his gaze fixed on Vulov as his mind raced, calculating every single possibility. "My life?" Vulov laughed. "You will trade your life to save the girl. That sounds fair, does it not? A boss for a worthless child. It seems like a very good deal for me." Nate gave a slow nod, pretending to think about it. "Fine, let the girl go. Your weapon first." Nate placed his gun on the ground and lifted his hands into the air. Vulov gestured for his men to advance. And at that precise second, the sound of a single gunshot echoed from a broken window high above that no one had seen. Alio, now acting as a sniper, had climbed into position while Nate created the diversion. His bullet traveled with deadly accuracy, straight through the head of the man who was holding Mia. Chaos erupted. Nate lunged at Mia. He pulled her into his arms and used his body to shield her. As a hailstorm of bullets came down, one ripped through his shoulder, and the pain felt like fire. But he kept going. He held the trembling girl and rolled behind a large shipping container. He protected her from the storm of bullets that was tearing the room apart. The fight was savage. Nate's team suffered heavy losses. 2 of his men were killed in the first few minutes, but they did not fall back. One by one, Volkov's men were taken down. They captured positions. They took back ground until only Volkov was left. He was wounded in the leg and slumped against a wall with an empty weapon in his hand. Nate walked toward him. Blood was running from his shoulder and down his arm. His gray eyes were steady. "You know what is going to happen now, Volkov?" he said, still smiling, even as he was about to die. Carlo will see me right after I'm finished with you." Nate interrupted him. He lifted his gun, and without saying anything else, he pulled the trigger. Volkov's body collapsed. His head snapped back before it fell to the side. His eyes stared without seeing at the warehouse ceiling. Nate turned and went back to, there she was, Tucked behind a steel container, Mia's wide eyes were a mix of terror and absolute trust. He knelt down, his movements slow, and carefully gathered her into his arms. Mia's small hands gripped his neck as she cried. "Uncle Candy," she sobbed. "I was so afraid." She whispered, "I want my mom." "I know you do," Nate murmured, his voice so gentle it was impossible to connect him to the man who had just ended Vulov's life without a second thought. "I am taking you to her right now. I promise." As Nate's team took the warehouse, a second unit smashed through the doors of Carlo's penthouse, capturing him easily. Carlo was drunk, in the middle of a celebration, and had no idea what was happening before he was knocked out cold and restrained. He now knelt on the chilly concrete floor of the secure bunker. His hands were bound, his face swollen and bruised from the capture. Before him stood Nathaniel Corsetti, the cousin he was so sure was dead and gone. Val watched from a corner of the room. In the next room, Mia was sleeping soundly after Nate's personal doctor confirmed she was unharmed aside from the shock. Val did not want to be here. She had no desire to see what was coming, but she had to have the truth. She needed to hear it from the man who had almost taken her child from her. "Cousin," Nate began, his tone so cold it felt like the temperature in the room dropped. "I know you murdered Isabel and my son." Carlo raised his head. Fear now replaced the drunken haze in his bloodshot eyes. How did you find out?" "Her," Nate said, pointing to Val, the woman this whole empire had treated like garbage. "She found everything when no one else could." Carlo's eyes darted to Val, filled with a look of pure hatred and disgust. "That piece of—" A gunshot cracked through the air. The bullet ripped into Carlo's knee, sending bone and blood spraying outward. He screamed, collapsing to the floor in agony. "Never speak about her that way," Nate said, his gun still smoking. "The next one goes through your other knee. After that, I will aim for what is between your legs. And I will keep going until there is nothing left of you." Carlo writhed on the concrete, a pathetic mess of tears, snot, and blood. This was the ruin of a man who believed he was destined to rule all of Chicago. "Okay, okay," he shrieked, his voice distorted by agony. "I will talk. I will tell you everything." And he confessed. He described the years of resentment he held for Nate. He hated that Nate was the heir to everything while he, the older cousin, received nothing. He explained how he reached out to Volkov 5 years ago, methodically planning the takeover. Then he spoke about the car bombing 3 years prior. He described hiring the men who planted the explosive in Isabel's car. He admitted to watching from a safe distance as it detonated, killing Nate's wife and son. "I did not think the boy would be in the car," Carlos stammered, his voice trembling as if that one detail would grant him mercy. "I only wanted to kill your wife. I wanted to break you, to make you easier to manage. I had no idea you were taking him to school that day." Nate remained perfectly still, his gray eyes locked on Carlo, unblinking. Val could see Nate's hand shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of holding back a rage that could set the entire world on fire. "My son was 4 years old," Nate said, his voice chillingly calm. "He called you uncle, Carlo. He was so happy when you brought him presents. Every single time he saw you, he would run to hug your legs and just laugh." Carlo was sobbing now, tears cutting paths through the blood on his face. "Brother, I am begging you. We are family. Your father and my father were brothers. You cannot do this." "You killed my family," Nate interrupted, taking a step forward and aiming the gun at Carlo's head. "You murdered my 4-year-old son. You murdered my wife. You abandoned me in hell for 3 years while I hunted for an enemy who was never there. Do you think our blood means anything to me now?" Carlos screamed and pleaded and cried. Nate did not hear him. He stood over the man who had shattered his world. In his gray eyes, there was no pity, no indecision, only the stark justice of his world. "My son," Nate stated, his voice like fracturing ice. "His name was Marcus. You were his trusted uncle. You brought him toys while you were planning to extinguish his life. He told everyone he wanted to be an astronaut. He will never have the chance to grow up. Nate pulled the trigger. The shot echoed in the bunker, and then there was only silence. Carlo Corsetti lay still on the concrete floor, a pool of blood spreading from the hole in his forehead. His eyes were wide open, frozen in a look of endless terror. Val stood in the corner and saw it all, and she felt no fear. She understood. In this world, this was the only form of justice there was, and sometimes justice was painted in blood. 3 months had passed since that violent night. On the surface, Chicago had settled back into its old rhythm. Nathaniel Corsetti had taken back complete control. The Corsetti Empire was now more powerful than before. Once the traitors were removed, everyone who remained learned the true cost of betrayal. He changed how the family did business. He shut down the nightclubs that men like Rico Santino used to operate. He completely dismantled the human trafficking rings he had always hated and moved their money into legitimate enterprises instead of narcotics. People whispered that the boss was different, that his brush with death had made him soft. But Val knew it was much more complex than that. She knew Nate was just as unforgiving as ever when he had to be, just as capable of killing without a second thought if anyone threatened those he cared for. Yet he was also the man who gently carried Mia out of that blood-soaked warehouse, the one who vowed to protect both her and her mother no matter the cost. Val and Mia began a new life under Nate's care in a secure apartment. It was in a middle-class area, a world away from the South Side slums where they had suffered for so many years. The two-bedroom home was pristine, with large windows that looked out over a park, a functional heating system, and a refrigerator that was never empty. It was a heaven compared to the damp, single room they had shared before. Still, Val consistently turned down his offers to live in his mansion. "I do not need your charity," she told him during one of his visits. "I need to support myself. I have depended on men for my entire life, and I will not let Mia grow up believing a woman needs someone else to survive." Nate did not argue or pressure her. He just nodded, showing her a level of respect she had never experienced from any other man. Instead of giving her money, he helped her launch a small bakery on a quiet street corner. He did not hand her cash, but instead offered a loan with zero interest and no fixed repayment date. "This is honest work," he explained. "Something you can take pride in, something Mia can be proud of when she is older." The bakery was named Mia's Kitchen. Val poured her energy into it, working from dawn until dusk. She kneaded dough, baked bread, and greeted customers with a smile she thought she had lost forever. The skin on her hands was no longer chapped from harsh cleaning supplies. It was now dusted with flour and sugar, a sweet trade for a bitter past. Mia started at a good elementary school, made new friends, had plenty of toys, and lived a childhood Val had only ever dreamed of providing. But an unspoken space lingered between Val and Nate, one that neither of them dared to cross. Nate visited frequently. He played games with Mia, taught her to read just as he had promised, and brought her gifts of stuffed animals and colorful books. Mia adored him, calling him Uncle Nate and loving him like the father she never knew. Yet whenever Nate's eyes met Val's, whenever their hands briefly touched, they both felt a connection they were too cautious to acknowledge, pulled away, as if they feared one step forward would cause everything to crumble. One evening, long after Mia was asleep, Nate came to the bakery as Val was closing for the night. He took a seat at a small table by the window and watched her clean. For a long time, neither of them said a word. "I used to be a prostitute," Val said suddenly. Her voice was quiet, but it trembled, as if she were finally releasing a weight she had carried for months. "You are a mafia boss. You have everything: power, money, the entire city. And what am I? A woman with a dirty past that can never be washed away. This cannot—" "Cannot what?" Nate asked, getting up and moving toward her. Val stepped back until she was pressed against the counter. "People will talk. They will say you have lost your mind for being with someone like me." "Let them talk," Nate interrupted. his gray eyes focused on her with an intensity she had never seen before. I do not care about who you were, I care about who you are. You are the woman who saved my life when I had nothing. You saw me when the rest of the world looked away. You showed me that there was something to live for besides revenge. He lifted his hand, his fingers gently touching her cheek. Val felt tears stream down her face, not realizing she had started to cry. I lost my wife and son once, Nate said, his voice dropping low. I will not lose you and Mia because of what other people think. Not because of the fear you carry, or because of a past that was never your fault. Val looked up at him, at the most powerful man in Chicago, whose eyes were filled with so much pain and so much hope. And in that moment, she understood they were both terrified. They were afraid of being hurt again, afraid of losing something so important. But maybe, just maybe, they could learn to face that fear together. Another 6 months went by. The bond between Val and Nate grew slowly but deeply, like roots taking a firm hold in the earth. They did not rush it. They let it happen naturally, in its own time. Nate came to the bakery every evening when she closed. He helped her clean up, and afterward they would sit together, drinking coffee and talking. Sometimes they spoke of serious things, and sometimes they just talked about the simple routines of daily life. He shared dinner with Val and Mia no less than 3 times each week. He learned the simple recipes Mia loved. He mastered reading fairy tales, giving every character a unique voice just to hear her laugh. Mia called him Uncle Nate, and she loved him as if he were her own father. Then one evening, while Val was tucking her in, the little girl asked a question that made Val's heart clench. Mom, could Uncle Nate be my dad? Val had no idea what to say. She just pulled her daughter close and promised to speak with Uncle Nate, though she had no clue what words she would use. But it seemed Nate already had his own answer prepared. On an evening in late May, as spring melted into summer and the Chicago air grew warm, he arrived to pick Val up after she closed the shop. He was not in his usual black sport utility vehicle, but in a polished limousine. Val asked with surprise, "Where are we going?" Nate opened her door and replied, "There is somewhere I need to show you. It is a place I have never taken anyone before." They traveled through the city, down streets she knew, and into neighborhoods she had never seen, before the car came to a stop before a massive downtown skyscraper, one of Chicago's tallest structures. Nate guided her through the grand lobby to a private elevator. It took them to the highest floor, and then up a tight set of stairs that opened onto the rooftop. When the metal door swung open, Val froze at the sight that greeted her. The whole of Chicago was spread out far below. Millions of lights glittered like stars that had fallen to earth. Lake Michigan mirrored the moonlight on the horizon. A soft breeze carried the smell of the approaching summer. Nate walked toward the edge of the roof and gazed down at the city. Val noticed his shoulders grow tense, like he was about to say something that was incredibly hard. He spoke in a low, faraway voice. "This is the place where I am darkest." He said, 3 years ago, right after Isabel and Marcus died, I came up here. I stood in this exact spot, looking down, convinced that a single step would make all the suffering end. Val felt her heart stop for a moment. She went to his side. She stood near him, silent, just listening. I stayed here for hours, Nate went on. I considered letting go. I thought about ending it all, but then I took a step back. It was not because I wanted to keep living, but because I had to find out who destroyed my family. The need for revenge was the only thing that kept me tied to this world. He turned and faced Val, his gray eyes shimmering in the moonlight. But you gave me a different reason, a reason that was so much better. Val felt tears forming, the words stuck in her throat. Nate reached inside his jacket, took out a small box made of black velvet, and got down on one knee before her. Val's heart pounded, her legs felt weak, and she could not process what was happening. Valentina Mendes, Nate said, opening the box. A simple silver ring with a finely carved rose sat inside. It was not a pricey diamond or a sparkling jewel, but the exact thing she had once mentioned loving in a conversation she assumed he had long forgotten. You rescued me from the darkness. You saw the real me when I was invisible to everyone else. You gave me hope when I believed there was none left. You taught me that life could have meaning beyond vengeance and pain. He stopped, taking a shaky breath. And Val noticed his eyes were shining, not from the city lights, but with his own tears. The most powerful man in Chicago was struggling to keep his composure. I am not worthy of you. I know that. I have blood on my hands, a sinful past, and a darkness in my soul. But I am willing to spend the rest of my days trying to deserve you. I want to open my eyes every morning and find you next to me. I want to see Mia grow up and have her call me Dad. I want to create a family with you, a true family, not one built on power or money, but one built on love. He looked directly into her eyes, his voice shaking but filled with sincerity. Valentina, will you marry me? Tears flowed freely down Val's face, and she made no effort to wipe them away. She looked at the man on one knee before her, the man the entire city once called a monster, who had shown more gentleness to her and her daughter than anyone else. The man who had almost died for her, and had eliminated dozens to bring Mia home safely. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. Yes, I will. Nate rose, slipped the ring on her finger, and then he kissed her. There on the roof of the tallest building in Chicago, under a sky filled with stars. Two souls that the world had cast aside had finally found one another in the shadows and decided to walk into the light as one. The wedding was not held in a massive cathedral downtown or at a five-star hotel that the elite preferred. It took place in the humble St. Michael's Church on the south side, where Father Patrick Brennan officiated. He was the elderly priest who had been the only person to never pass judgment on Val during her most difficult years. It had been Val's decision, and Nate had agreed without any hesitation, because he knew this ceremony was not for showing off power or riches. It was about two people who discovered each other in the dark and made the choice to move into the light together. On that August morning, sunlight poured through the church's stained glass windows, painting vibrant colors on the old wooden floors. The small chapel was full, not with strangers from high society, but with the people who were truly important in Val and Nate's lives. Abuela Carmen sat in the first row, already crying before the service had even started. The woman who had rescued Val 5 years before was now witnessing her begin a new chapter. Val's old colleagues from her time as a cleaner were there. They were people who had also been ignored and cast aside, now wearing the best clothes they had, feeling proud that one of their own had found happiness. Alio stood next to Nate as his best man, his injuries now completely healed, while Theo sat several rows behind him with a small, rare smile on his typically serious face. Nate's devoted guards were also present. These were the men who had been prepared to give their lives for him, and now they were watching him find his own joy. Then the church doors swung open, and Val appeared. She was in a simple but beautiful wedding dress of ivory white with fine lace. It was not a grand gown with a long train, but a knee-length dress that matched the simple style she had always cherished. Her hair was down, decorated with little roses, and she had on no jewelry other than the engagement ring Nate gave her on that rooftop. But the person who stole everyone's heart was not Val. It was Mia, at 6 years old, walking just ahead of her mother, dropping white rose petals on the floor. She had on a full white dress. Her hair was in two little braids tied with pink ribbons, and she wore the most brilliant smile Val had ever seen on her. Mia tossed the petals with intense focus, as if it were the most critical task in the world, and each small step she took made everyone in the room smile warmly. When Val and Mia arrived at the altar, Nate was there waiting in a formal black suit, but his gray eyes were not on the dress or the flowers. His gaze was fixed only on Val, as if she was the only person that existed in that room, in the entire world. Father Patrick started with prayers and blessings. After that, it was time for the vows. Nate held Val's hand, his voice quiet but firm as he spoke. I cannot promise you perfection, because I am not perfect. I have blood on my hands, a past full of sin, and a darkness in me that may never completely fade. But I do promise to use everything I am, my strength, my power, and even my brutality when necessary, to keep you and Mia safe. I promise to love you not for being flawless, but for being exactly who you are, with every scar and every part of your history. And I promise that you will never have to be alone again. You will never have to feel afraid by yourself. You will never have to fight your battles by yourself. Val squeezed his hand, tears rolling down her face as she said her own vow. I once thought that I was not deserving of love. I believed my past would always dictate my future. But you showed me I was wrong. You saw me when the rest of the world looked right through me. You believed in me when nobody else would. You gave me the courage to stand up and a reason to continue on. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, but I know I want to experience it with you, whether it is filled with light or darkness, happiness or sorrow. Father Patrick pronounced them husband and wife, and as Nate kissed Val, the church filled with applause. But the sound they heard above all others was Mia's happy shout when she cried out, "Now we are a family!" She pushed in between them, wrapping her arms around them both. And in that instant, inside a little church on the south side, three people who had been let down by the world finally discovered their home. In the year 2036, 12 years after the wedding, the Corsetti estate in the Chicago suburbs echoed with laughter on a Sunday morning in April. Mia, who was now 17, was sitting by the living room window, a heavy law book resting in her hands. She dreamed of becoming a lawyer to defend women who were like her mother had been. Women let down by the system with no one to fight for them. Nate had formally adopted her soon after the wedding, and she wore the Corsetti name with a deep pride. Marco Nathaniel Corsetti, who was 10 years old and the first son of Nate and Val, sat in his father's office. He was learning to analyze financial statements with a focus well beyond his years. He was the spitting image of his father, with intense gray eyes and a defined jawline. But he possessed his mother's kind heart, always willing to protect those who were weaker. The twins, Isabel Rose and Luna Marie, who were 7 years old, were named for Nate's first wife and Val's late mother. They were chasing each other through the expansive garden, their bright laughter sounding like music. The two girls were identical, with long dark hair and their mother's brown eyes, and yet their smiles were all their own, were clearly their father's. Anthony James, at 4 years old, was the youngest in the family. He followed his sisters on his small, wobbly legs. His strikingly blue eyes were inherited from his grandmother, and he had a determined spirit that would not let him be left behind, even though he was the smallest. Nate was now 50. His hair was almost completely gray, but his body was still strong. He sat on the porch and watched his children play with an expression that nobody would have believed was possible 12 years ago. It was the look of a man who was happy and at peace. He had moved away from most of the illegal businesses and had transitioned the Corsetti empire into legitimate ventures. He still held power, but it was a cleaner kind of power, the sort of power his children could admire. Val came out onto the porch carrying a tray of lemonade. She was 40 years old, and her hair was still dark, with just a few streaks of silver. Her hands were no longer rough from harsh chemicals. They were now soft from making dough and from love. She had started a charity to help women who wanted to get off the streets. She taught them new skills, gave them a safe place to live, and offered them a chance to start over. Money from the Corsetti empire flowed. He poured himself into it, a way to make amends for his past and a promise for their future. Anthony ran to his mother and tugged on her dress, his blue eyes bright with excitement. "Mom, please tell the story of how you rescued Dad." It was the children's favorite tale, even after hearing it 1,000 times. It was a story about a brave mother and a father who was once a monster, saved by love. Val and Nate shared a look and a soft smile. The entire family settled onto the porch, finding comfort in the shade of the old oak tree Nate planted on their wedding day. Once upon a time, Val started, her voice full of warmth. There was a completely ordinary woman who worked in a very dark place. And she met a monster who was locked away in a basement, Marco added, knowing every single word by heart. But he was never a real monster, Mia said, looking at her adoptive father with love. He was just waiting for someone to finally see him. Nate wrapped his arms around Val and gently kissed her hair. And when she saw him, the monster knew he had found a reason to live. Daddy, Isabel Rose asked, her voice clear and innocent. Are you still a monster? Nate looked at his daughter, then at Val, and then at all the children he never thought he could have. I will always have a piece of the monster inside me, he answered with honesty. But that part only comes out to protect the people I love. With this family, I only ever want to be a dad. As the sun went down over Chicago, the Corsetti family sat close together. Their laughter echoed in the twilight, and the smell of roses from Val's garden filled the evening air. They had found each other in the darkness, and together they built a home in the light. Their life is proof that love can grow in the most hopeless places. It shows that redemption can come from hands the world had given up on. It proves that a person's worth is not measured by their past, but by the choices they make when everything is against them. This story reminds us to never judge someone by how they look or what they have been through. Because inside every person is the power to change, a light that is just waiting for someone to notice. It also teaches us that courage is not about being fearless. It is about choosing to act even when you are shaking with fear, and that sometimes it just takes one person who refuses to look away to change a life completely. If this story found a place in your heart, please subscribe to our channel. Like and share this video so we can continue to bring you powerful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Did it bring up anything from your own life? Please leave a comment for us below. We genuinely want to know what is on your mind. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a happy life, and days filled with peace. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and we will see you again in our next video. This content was carefully researched, crafted, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful lessons and inspiration. Every story we share is designed to touch your heart and remind you of your own strength. Thank you for being part of our community,